Under the shimmering lights of the Harrington Global Tower, a sedan braked hard. CEO Vanessa Whitmore slid inside, glancing at her new driver, Finn Gallagher. His suit was plain, his posture razor straight, his eyes tracking angles like a tactician. Minutes later, armored SUVs boxed them in. Glass shattered. Vanessa screamed. Finn moved precise, spinning the car, shielding her, disarming a gunman, sleeve ripping to expose an insignia few civilians recognize. The U.S. Shadow Rangers. Sirens wailed. Vanessa trembled. Who was her driver, and why were federal agents watching? The morning light slanted through the underground garage of Whitmore Industries, casting long shadows across concrete columns and oil-stained floors. Finn Gallagher stood beside the black sedan, running his hand along the doorframe with the methodical attention of a man who had learned that survival lived in the details. He adjusted the rearview mirror twice, checked the distance from the steering wheel to the seat, traced the sight lines to every exit ramp. In the trunk, he placed a first aid kit, flashlight, zip ties, and a roll of duct tape. Nothing that would raise questions. Everything that might save a life. An hour earlier, he had dropped his son Caleb at the public elementary school on the south side. The boy had pressed his hand against the window, brown eyes steady and serious beyond his 7 years. Finn had taught him the breathing technique last winter, the one they used in the Rangers to control fear when mortars fell and the world turned to noise and fire. Box breathing. 4 counts in, 4 counts hold, 4 counts out, 4 counts hold. Caleb had whispered through the cracked window, asking if his dad would disappear again. Finn had promised, the way fathers do when they know promises are all they have left to give. He would not vanish. He would come home. Now, standing in the garage beneath a tower that reached 40 stories into the Chicago skyline, Finn signed the non-disclosure agreement on a clipboard held by a woman in a gray blazer. Helen Brooks, executive assistant to the CEO, watched him with the sharp patience of someone who had seen 100 contractors come and go. She handed him a laminated card with routes, backup routes, and protocols for delays. She told him Miss Whitmore valued punctuality and discretion above all else. Finn nodded once, slipped the card into his jacket pocket, and said nothing. He had learned long ago that silence was a kind of armor, and words were grenades you could never take back. When Vanessa Whitmore emerged from the private elevator at 7:45, she moved like someone who had been raised on marble floors and expectations carved from stone. Her blonde hair was pulled into a sharp twist, her red blazer tailored to the millimeter, her heels striking the concrete with the rhythm of someone who measured time in profit margins and board votes. She glanced at Finn the way people glance at furniture, her gaze skating past him without landing. He opened the rear door, kept his eyes forward, and said the only 2 words he would speak for the next 20 minutes. "Yes, ma'am." As the car pulled into traffic, Finn's eyes moved constantly. He scanned the motorcycles weaving between lanes, the delivery trucks idling at corners, the pedestrians who looked too long at the sedan's tinted windows. His hands rested lightly on the wheel, but his body was coiled, a spring waiting for the moment it would need to release. Vanessa sat in the back, scrolling through her phone. Her voice clipped as she took calls about contracts and logistics and shareholders who wanted her to prove she was more than her father's daughter. She did not notice the way Finn checked the mirrors every 6 seconds, or the way his jaw tightened when a black SUV merged too close behind them, or the way his fingers tapped the wheel in a rhythm that matched the breathing technique he had taught his son. The pressure had been building for weeks. Vanessa stood in the boardroom on the 38th floor, facing 12 men and women who looked at her with the polite skepticism reserved for those who inherit power rather than earn it. The contract on the table was worth $5 billion, a defense logistics deal that would cement Whitmore Industries as a cornerstone of national supply chains. But the board wanted guarantees. They wanted her to prove she understood risk, that she could navigate the gray waters her father, Jonathan Whitmore, had sailed before his death 2 years ago, in what the official report called a vehicular accident on a rural highway. Vanessa had read that report 100 times, searching for the truth between the lines, and every time she closed the file, the same question whispered in the back of her mind. Why had her father been on that road at all? Helen had suggested increasing personal security. Vanessa had refused. She did not want to look weak, did not want the press to print photographs of her hiding behind bodyguards, while male CEOs walked the city streets unguarded. She told Helen that fear was a luxury she could not afford, and Helen had said nothing, because loyalty meant knowing when to argue and when to simply write the memo and file it away. The night it happened, the rain came down like a curtain of static, blurring the highway into streaks of red and white light. Vanessa sat in the back of the sedan, her laptop open, reviewing the final amendments to the Harrington Global Partnership. Finn drove in silence, his eyes moving between the road and the mirrors, his body language tightening in a way Vanessa did not notice until the black SUVs appeared on either side of them, boxing the sedan into the center lane. The first impact came from the left, a sharp jolt that sent Vanessa's laptop sliding to the floor. She looked up, mouth opening to ask what was happening, and then the rear window exploded inward, glass spraying across the leather seats like shrapnel. She screamed, hands flying up to cover her face, and Finn moved. He yanked the wheel hard right, the sedan fishtailing as he cut across 2 lanes, tires shrieking against wet asphalt. One of the SUVs tried to follow, but Finn hit the brakes, let it overshoot, then accelerated into a spin that turned the car 180 degrees in 3 seconds flat. Vanessa was thrown against the door, her seatbelt locking across her chest, and through the chaos she saw Finn's face in the rearview mirror, calm as stone, his voice low and steady as he said one word. Down. She dropped to the floor. The sedan reversed at speed, Finn's hand working the wheel with the precision of someone who had done this before, who had trained in places where mistakes meant body bags and silence. Another SUV tried to cut them off, but Finn clipped its front bumper, sent it spinning into the guardrail, and then he was accelerating forward again, weaving through the sparse traffic with a control that felt less like panic and more like choreography. A man leaned out of the passenger window of the remaining SUV, something metallic glinting in his hand, and Finn slammed the brakes again, letting the vehicle pull alongside. In one motion, he opened his door, reached out, and grabbed the man's wrist, twisting until the weapon clattered to the road. The man shouted, tried to pull back, but Finn held him for another second, long enough for his sleeve to tear, long enough for Vanessa to see the tattoo on his forearm, a winged dagger over a scroll that read, Silent Valor. Sirens wailed in the distance. The remaining SUV peeled away into the rain, and Finn eased the sedan to the shoulder, his breathing slow and measured as if he had just finished a walk instead of a fight. Vanessa pulled herself back onto the seat, her hands shaking, her heart hammering against her ribs. She stared at the man in the driver's seat. This stranger she had hired 3 weeks ago, this man who had moved like violence, was a language he spoke fluently, and she asked the question that would crack the surface of everything she thought she knew. Where did you learn to drive like that? Finn met her eyes in the rearview mirror. And for the first time since she had hired him, he held her gaze. His answer was quiet, each word chosen with care. Enough places to get you home safe, Miss Whitmore. Police cruisers arrived, lights painting the rain in blue and red pulses. Officers took statements, photographed the shattered window, called for a tow truck to clear the wrecked SUV from the guardrail. Vanessa stood under an umbrella, her arms wrapped around herself, watching as 2 men in plain suits spoke with Finn near the sedan. They were not uniformed officers. They were something else. One of them nodded at Finn, said something too low for Vanessa to hear, and when Finn glanced over his shoulder at her, his expression was unreadable. A door closing before she could see what was behind it. The next morning, Vanessa sat in her office, staring at the city skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. Helen entered with a tablet, her face carefully neutral. Vanessa did not ask if she had done the research. She simply waited. Helen set the tablet on the desk, and Vanessa read the file on Finn Gallagher. It was thin. Too thin. Date of birth, social security number, a single address in a neighborhood where rent was paid in cash and questions were not asked. And then, at the bottom, a notation in red text. Sealed military record. Keywords flagged. Kia/MIA, Shadow Rangers, classified operation. Clearance required for further access. Helen spoke quietly, her voice carrying the weight of someone delivering bad news. If we push deeper, we cross legal lines. Federal lines. Vanessa did not look away from the screen. She asked the question that had kept her awake until dawn. Who is he? Helen did not have an answer. Over the next week, small things went wrong. The tires on Vanessa's personal car were slashed in the parking garage. The cuts, clean and deliberate. Her keycard to the executive floor was cloned, used to access her office at 3 in the morning when the building was empty, except for night security. A cup of coffee intended for Helen sat on her desk one afternoon. And when Finn walked past, he stopped, leaned down, and whispered one word. "Don't." Helen stared at him, then at the cup, and Finn produced a small testing kit from his jacket pocket, the kind used to detect chemical tampering. The strip turned purple within seconds. Finn did not wait for permission. He walked through the executive floor, assessing sightlines, checking door locks, speaking to the building's security team with the clipped authority of someone who had commanded men in places where failure meant death. The guards listened. Some of them recognized the cadence of his voice, the way he moved, the way he treated every room like a map of threats and solutions. By the end of the day, the executive floor had new protocols, new cameras, and a rotation schedule that closed the gaps Finn had identified in under an hour. Vanessa watched from her office, half hidden behind the glass wall, and for the first time since her father's death, she felt something shift in her chest, something that was not suspicion or fear, but a kind of reluctant trust, the way you trust a bridge, only after you have watched it hold weight you did not think it could carry. The news broke 3 days later. An anonymous source leaked to a defense blog that Captain Finn Gallagher, formerly of the Army's Shadow Rangers, had been declared killed in action during a classified operation 6 years ago, only to resurface under circumstances that remained sealed. The blog did not speculate. It simply published the name, the unit, and the questions. Vanessa read the article twice, then walked to the window, her reflection faint against the glass. She thought about the tattoo on Finn's arm, the way he had disarmed a gunman without hesitation, the way he had known the coffee was poisoned before anyone else had thought to check. She thought about her father, about the last conversation they had before he died, the one where he had told her that power meant nothing if you did not know who to trust. She turned, called Helen, and said 4 words. "I need to see him." That evening, Vanessa received a call from the hospital on the south side. Caleb Gallagher had been admitted with a respiratory infection, nothing life-threatening but enough to keep him overnight for observation. Finn had requested unpaid leave, his voice steady but hollow when he spoke to Helen. Vanessa did not think. She drove herself to the hospital, walked past the nurse's station, and found the room at the end of the pediatric wing. Through the door's narrow window, she saw Finn sitting beside a small bed, his large hand resting on his son's chest. The boy was awake, his breathing labored but steady. And Finn was speaking in a low voice, counting out loud. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds hold, 4 seconds hold, 4 seconds hold, 4 seconds hold. Caleb followed the rhythm, his small chest rising and falling, and Finn did not look away, did not check his phone, did not do anything, except breathe with his son until the boy's panic eased and his eyes began to close. Vanessa stood in the hallway, her hand pressed against the cool wall, and something inside her cracked open. Something she had kept locked since her father's funeral, since the board meetings where men twice her age spoke to her like she was a child playing dress-up in her father's chair. She left before Finn saw her. But the next morning, when the hospital called Helen to confirm payment, the bill had been reduced by half, marked as an anonymous charitable donation. Finn did not ask. He simply nodded when he returned to work, his eyes meeting Vanessa's for one brief second before he opened the car door and said the only 2 words he ever said. "Yes, ma'am." The day Damian Cross walked into Whitmore Industries, the air in the lobby seemed to thin. He was tall and gaunt. His suit, a shade of silver gray that caught the light like polished steel. His hair was slicked back, blonde and gleaming, and his eyes were the color of winter fog, pale and cold, and utterly devoid of warmth. He wore a diamond watch on his left wrist, the kind that cost more than most people earned in a year. And when he smiled at the receptionist, it was the smile of a man who knew he had already won. Helen met him at the elevator, her expression professional but wary. He introduced himself as the CEO of Silverline Global, a logistics firm that had been expanding aggressively into defense contracts over the past 2 years. He wanted to discuss a partnership, he said. A win-win situation. Something that would honor the legacy of Jonathan Whitmore. Finn stood in the corner of the lobby, near the security desk, his posture relaxed but his eyes tracking every movement Damien made. When the elevator doors closed, Finn did not move. He simply watched the numbers climb, his jaw tight, his hands loose at his sides. One of the younger guards asked if everything was all right. Finn did not answer. Upstairs, Vanessa met Damien in the conference room, Helen at her side. Damien was smooth, his voice modulated with the careful precision of someone who had been coached in persuasion. He spoke about efficiency, about shared resources, about the opportunities that came from consolidating supply chains in a market that was growing more competitive every quarter. He did not mention her father by name again, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. He knew things that could help her or hurt her, depending on how willing she was to cooperate. Vanessa thanked him for his time, told him she would review the proposal, and watched as he stood, adjusted his cuffs, and left the room with the unhurried confidence of a man who believed the outcome was inevitable. When the door closed, Helen turned to her, and Vanessa asked the question that had been building since the moment Damien had smiled. Who is he, really? Helen did not have an answer. But Finn did. That night, Vanessa unlocked the door to her father's study in the family estate outside the city, a room she had not entered since the funeral. The air smelled of leather and old paper, and the shelves were lined with books Jonathan had collected over a lifetime, histories of wars and treatises on strategy and novels about men who had tried to do the right thing and failed. In the corner, behind a painting of a clipper ship cutting through dark water, was the safe. Vanessa entered the combination, the same 6 digits her father had used for everything, and the door swung open. Inside were documents, deeds, letters from lawyers, and at the bottom, a hard drive labeled in her father's handwriting. Rangers. She stared at it for a long time, her hands trembling, and then she called Finn. He arrived an hour later, still wearing the plain suit, his hair damp from the rain. Vanessa handed him the drive without speaking, and Finn held it like it was something fragile, something that might shatter if he gripped too hard. He looked at the label, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw something flicker across his face. Not fear, not anger, something deeper, recognition, loss, the weight of a past he had tried to bury. They plugged the drive into her father's laptop, and the screen filled with files, video logs, reports, maps, and at the top, a single video file dated 3 months before Jonathan's death. Vanessa clicked it, and her father's face appeared, older than she remembered, tired in a way that had nothing to do with age. Jonathan Whitmore spoke directly to the camera, his voice low and steady. He said he had discovered something, a smuggling operation embedded in the supply chains he managed, routes that moved more than steel and electronics, routes that carried weapons to places they should never go. The trail led to Silverline Global, to shell companies, and falsified manifests, and a man named Damien Cross, who had built an empire on silence and blood. Jonathan said he had tried to go through official channels, but the channels were clogged with people who had reasons to look the other way. So he had reached out to someone he trusted, someone who had saved his life years ago during a classified operation that never made it into any official record. He said the name once, clearly. Captain Finn Gallagher. The video ended. Vanessa sat in the dim light of the study, her hands clenched in her lap. She turned to Finn, and he was standing by the window, his back to her, his shoulders rigid. She asked the question that had been circling since the night on the highway. Who are you? Finn did not turn. He spoke to the glass, to his own reflection, to the ghosts of men he had lost. He said he had been part of a unit that did not exist on paper, a team that went into places where wars were fought in silence, and the only witnesses were the dead. He said his team had been betrayed, sold out by someone who wanted to tie up loose ends, and most of them had not made it home. He had survived by going dark, by disappearing into the kind of life where no one asked questions and paperwork was just another story you told. He had done it to protect his son, to keep Caleb safe from the people who would use a child as leverage against a man who knew too much. He said he had come back because of a debt. Because Jonathan Whitmore had been on that operation years ago, a civilian contractor who had been caught in the crossfire, and Finn had pulled him out of a burning vehicle while mortars shook the ground. Jonathan had never forgotten. And when Jonathan had needed help, when he had needed someone who understood that some fights could not be won with lawyers and press releases, he had called the only man he trusted. Finn had said yes, even though it meant stepping back into the light, even though it meant risking everything he had built to keep his son safe. He had said yes because some debts could not be measured in money or time, and some promises were written in blood. Vanessa stood, walked to where he stood, and placed her hand on his arm. She did not say anything. She did not need to. The silence between them was no longer a wall. It was a bridge. 3 days later, Finn and Helen spread maps across the conference table, tracing routes through shipping manifests and customs logs. They found the pattern. A container line labeled SIL/GRY-17, a route that had appeared 6 months after Jonathan's death, moving through the port of Chicago with regularity that suggested automation, invisibility, the kind of operation that relied on no one looking too closely. The containers were listed as industrial components, steel frames, and hydraulic systems, but the weight discrepancies were subtle, just enough to hide what was really inside. Weapons, small arms, ammunition, components for devices that had no business crossing borders without oversight. Vanessa stood at the head of the table, her arms crossed, her mind calculating the cost of what she was about to do. If she went public, if she opened an investigation, Whitmore Industries would be dragged into a scandal that could destroy everything her father had built. But if she stayed silent, if she let the roots continue, she would become complicit in something her father had died trying to stop. She looked at Finn, and he met her gaze without flinching. He did not tell her what to do. He simply waited, the way a soldier waits for the order that will send him into the fire. Vanessa made her choice. She called Clinton Ward, the federal agent who had been circling the edges of the case since the night of the highway ambush. She told him everything. The drive, the roots, the connection to Silverline Global. She did not ask for protection. She asked for justice. 2 days later, Damian Cross extended an invitation. A private dinner at his estate, outside the city. A gesture of goodwill. A chance to discuss the future. Vanessa read the message twice, then handed her phone to Finn. He read it once, then said 2 words. "It's a trap." Vanessa nodded. But she also knew that some traps were the only way to force the predator into the open. She told Finn she was going, and she told him she needed him close, but not visible. She needed him to do what he had been trained to do. Protect, observe, and move when the moment came. Finn did not argue. He simply nodded, and for the first time in weeks, she saw something in his eyes that might have been approval, or respect, or the quiet understanding that comes when 2 people stop pretending they are anything other than what they are. Soldiers in different uniforms, fighting the same war. The estate was everything Vanessa expected. Cold, modern, all glass and steel and sharp edges that reflected light without warmth. Damian greeted her at the door, his smile razor-thin, his diamond watch catching the light like a signal flare. He led her through a hallway lined with abstract art, pieces that cost fortunes and meant nothing, and into a dining room where the table was set for 2. The guards were subtle, standing at the edges of the room in suits that did not quite hide the shapes beneath their jackets. Vanessa accepted a glass of wine, and then Finn's voice crackled in the tiny earpiece she wore, hidden beneath her hair. "Don't drink it." She set the glass down, untouched. And Damian watched her, with the flat curiosity of a man who had just realized the mouse he was toying with had teeth. The doors locked with a soft click. The guards moved forward, no longer pretending to be decoration. Damian leaned back in his chair, his hands folded, his voice calm. He said her father had lacked courage, that he had seen the opportunity and flinched, that Vanessa could make a different choice, could walk away from this room and forget what she had found, or she could follow her father into the ground. He asked which she preferred. Vanessa looked at him, And for the first time in her life, she felt no fear. She felt anger, cold and sharp and focused. She said one word. Neither. Glass exploded inward. Finn came through the side window in a controlled roll, a strobe grenade in one hand, his other hand already moving to disarm the nearest guard. The room erupted in white light and noise, and Vanessa dropped to the floor, covering her head as Finn moved with the brutal efficiency of a man who had done this 100 times in places where mistakes meant body bags. He disarmed the first guard with a strike to the wrist, swept the second off his feet with a low kick, and put the third on the ground with a chokehold that left the man gasping but alive. Damien ran. Finn grabbed Vanessa's hand, pulled her toward the shattered window, and they were through, and into the garden, before the lights came back on. Behind them, shouts and footsteps, and ahead, the dark line of trees at the edge of the property. They ran, Vanessa's heels sinking into the wet grass, Finn's hand steady on her arm, guiding her through the shadows. They reached the car parked a quarter-mile away, and Finn shoved her into the passenger seat, started the engine, and they were moving before she could catch her breath. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder. Helen's voice came through the radio. Federal agents en route. Vanessa looked at Finn, and he looked back. And neither of them spoke because there was nothing left to say that had not already been said in the way he had come through that window, the way he had chosen her safety over his own. The federal agents arrested Finn at the edge of the city, pulling the car over with a convoy of black SUVs and officers in tactical gear. Clinton Ward stepped forward, his badge clipped to his belt, his expression hard. He read Finn his rights, listed the charges. Unauthorized entry, assault, violation of federal security protocols, Vanessa shouted, tried to pull free of the officer holding her back, but Finn met her eyes and shook his head once. Don't. Trust the process. They took him away, and Vanessa stood on the side of the highway. Rain starting to fall again, her hands shaking with rage and helplessness. Helen arrived minutes later, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and drove her home in silence. The next morning, Vanessa walked into Clinton Ward's office without an appointment. She did not sit. She stood in front of his desk and told him that if he wanted to close the case on Jonathan Whitmore, if he wanted to dismantle the smuggling network that had been operating under federal noses for years, he needed two things: the container routes she had mapped, and the man sitting in a cell who knew how to read those routes better than anyone alive. She told him Finn Gallagher had saved her life twice, had risked everything to bring evidence to light, and if Ward wanted justice, he would stop treating Finn like a criminal and start treating him like the asset he was. Ward leaned back in his chair, studied her for a long moment, then opened a file on his desk. He said the investigation into Silverline Global had been ongoing for months, stalled by lack of hard evidence and too many layers of shell companies. He said Finn's arrival had been flagged, monitored, but not stopped, because sometimes the best way to catch a predator was to let the bait walk into the trap willingly. He said if Vanessa was willing to testify, if she was willing to put Whitmore Industries under the microscope, they could move forward. But it would cost her. It would cost both of them. Vanessa did not hesitate. She said yes. The operation at the port of Chicago happened 2 weeks later, a coordinated strike involving federal agents, customs enforcement, and a tactical team that moved through the container yard like shadows. They opened the container labeled GRY-17, and inside were crates marked as industrial steel. Inside the crates were weapons, enough to arm a small militia, enough to destabilize regions that had been fragile since the last war ended. Damien Cross was arrested at his estate, the mansion surrounded, every exit covered. He did not resist. He simply smiled, adjusted his diamond watch, and said one sentence before the officers led him away. Power is not about what you build. It is about what you can destroy. Vanessa did not watch the arrest. She was at Whitmore Industries, standing in front of the press, cameras flashing, microphones pressed forward. She read a statement she had written herself. No lawyers, no consultants. She said her father had discovered criminal activity embedded in the company's supply chains, and he had died trying to expose it. She said Whitmore Industries would cooperate fully with federal investigations, that they would implement new oversight protocols, and that she was launching Project Valor, an initiative to train veterans and former service members in logistics and management, giving them a second chance to serve in ways that honored their skills and sacrifices. She said her company would no longer measure success by profit margins alone, but by the integrity of the work they did and the people they chose to protect. When she finished, she stepped away from the microphones, walked back into the building, and found Finn waiting in the lobby. The charges had been dropped. The federal agent satisfied that his actions had been necessary and proportional. He stood near the glass doors, his son beside him, Caleb's small hand wrapped in his father's. The boy looked up at Vanessa with curious, serious eyes, and Finn said nothing, because words were no longer necessary. Vanessa walked to them, knelt down so she was eye level with Caleb, and asked if he would teach her the breathing trick his father had taught him. Caleb nodded, solemn and proud, and counted out loud. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds hold. 4 seconds out. 4 seconds hold. Vanessa followed, and for the first time in years, she felt her heartbeat slow, felt the weight in her chest ease, felt the fear that had lived in her bones since her father's death begin to dissolve. She stood, looked at Finn, and said 3 words. "Thank you, Captain." Finn shook his head, his voice quiet. Just Finn. 6 months later, the Walsh Monroe Foundation opened its doors in a renovated warehouse on the South Side, a space filled with tools and workbenches and classrooms where veterans learned logistics, supply chain management, and leadership. The sign above the door read, "Founded by those who fell and chose to rise." Vanessa stood beside Finn at the ribbon cutting, Caleb between them, and when the cameras flashed, she did not flinch. She simply smiled, her hand resting on the boy's shoulder, and looked at Finn, who looked back with the quiet understanding of a man who had finally come home. On a Sunday afternoon in early autumn, the 3 of them drove along the lakeshore, the water glittering under the golden light. Caleb sat in the back, drawing pictures of the city skyline, and Vanessa sat in the passenger seat, watching the road unfold ahead. Finn drove, his hands steady on the wheel, and every few minutes, their eyes met in the rearview mirror. A conversation without words, a promise without conditions. He had once driven to protect her life. Now they drove toward a shared future where truth, love, and redemption steered the same road.